Jenny Lind was a Swedish operatic soprano who was known as the Swedish Nightingale. And she was very popular in Europe, and so popular in Europe, in fact, that P.T. Barnum, the great impresario of showbiz and kind of flim-flam, signed Jenny Lind to a contract to do 100 concerts in the United States without having heard her sing a single note. And so when she came to America, there was this Lind mania that broke out. P.T. Barnum writes about this in his autobiography, and he says that we didn't have to promote her much because she was so popular, but soon there was Lind scarves and Jenny Lind perfume. There was race horses named after her. There were cigars that were called Jenny Lind cigars. There were packets of Jenny Lind cigarettes. She was promoted. She was merchandised. And she was so popular that when the California Gold Rush hit, many of the people who came from back east or from Europe or from other parts of the world brought with them this mania about Jenny Lind. And when they came to California, as a result, there were Jenny Lind hats that were sold in San Francisco. There were Jenny Lind clothing. There's Jenny Lind furniture. There was a wagon called the Jenny Lind that was commonly used. And there were many hotels. There were mines. There's a town in Calaveras County called Jenny Lind that was named after her. And up here in Nevada City, there was a theater built called the Jenny Lind Theater. And according to the accounts, it either straddled Deer Creek like a bridge, or it was probably cantilevered over the creek, which I think is more likely. And in 1852, there was a huge flood, very similar to what happened in 2017 here in Northern California. And the flood swept down through Deer Creek, and among the structures that were destroyed was a boarding house called the Illinois Boarding House, and right next to it was the Jenny Lind Theater. And it was washed down Deer Creek and shattered. Well, according to the newspaper account, this was in March of 1852, the Alta California newspaper said this. It says, "We have intelligence of a heavy disaster by flood at Nevada," meaning Nevada City. That was one of the original names of the town. "Two quartz mills, the Jenny Lind Theater, and the Empire Hotel have been washed away. The river was rushing in a foaming mad torrent through the lower part of the city. Great excitement existed, and fears were entertained for the safety of that action of the town. Several houses were swept down and considerable damage sustained by the merchants." According to other accounts, county histories, the Jenny Lind Theater was the prominent theater in Nevada City. There was Shakespeare, and there was comedy, and there was kind of music hall there. It was called, county history called it a pretty little building. And when it got washed away and was destroyed, it was heartbreaking to the people of Nevada City because this was their entertainment center. And so there started to be stories that were floating around, anecdotal stories about what had happened to the Jenny Lind Theater. And the grapevine being the grapevine, according to some accounts, it started to spread through the gold fields that Jenny Lind, the person, had been destroyed, had died. That Jenny Lind has disappeared, Jenny Lind is dead. And it led to great sadness in this part of the world, and it started to filter back east, that somehow Jenny Lind had passed away. And it wasn't, it was the theater that had been destroyed, but it shows the level of popularity and the level of interest people had in this extraordinary figure who never came to California. California today has a reputation as a foodie capital of the world. It has an origin back even prior to the gold rush from the Mexican Californio culture and the introduction of certain kinds of foodstuffs. But it totally changed during the California gold rush. And then all of these people, this overnight, California became the most ethnically diverse place on earth. And they brought with them all of their different foodstuffs and different kinds of cooking techniques. The California Gold Rush brought to California a bunch of young guys who teenagers and early 20s who didn't know how to cook and didn't want to cook, and it ended up leading to very bad nutrition. And if you look at the historical record of the time period, there are stories of sumptuous feasts, but there's a lot of stories, particularly in the gold fields, of the fact that people did not eat properly. There are many, many accounts of scurvy, for instance, that takes place. There are stories of young people who didn't know how to cook or cook badly, who end up eating a kind of gruel or this mixture of flour that they would heat on the blades of shovels, that they would cook, a kind of fry bread almost, that led to terrible nutrition. Many, many gold rushers ended up sick from poor nutrition. And one of the most startling statistics, I think, of the entire gold rush period is the fact that of all the people who came to California during the gold rush, almost 20% of them died within 6 months of arrival. And a lot of that was from nutrition, not just accidents, not just violence, but from the fact that medical treatment was bad or their systems were so depleted that they got very, very sick. And so today, when we have this reputation for this food capital of the world, I think that a lot of that comes from a reaction to the fact that this burst of population who came here ate very poorly. And they tried to make up for it by trying new things and using fresher ingredients. And I think it led to, quite early on, by the 1870s and 80s, and it became an experimental culture that still has ramifications and impacts all the way to the present day. I think it has a start, though, with a reaction to the very poor nutrition in the beginning. On my mom's side of the family, they came here to Grass Valley to live as part of the Okie migration. They were poor, and my grandmother, she was an extraordinary cook, and she could do anything with virtually nothing. What we used to do when I was a kid is we used to come out to Bitney Springs Road and go to Deer Creek, and we would gather watercress. She would make a gourmet meal out of sliced tomatoes and fried potatoes and watercress. That was fabulous. One historian has said there were more grizzly bears in California than human beings. The literature are filled with descriptions of grizzly bears. They're everywhere. And in fact, on the state seal of California, there's a grizzly bear eating wild grapes, which was a very, very common thing. Wild grapes were throughout the region. It was so common, in fact, that those grapes were called bear grapes. Bull and bear fights were a very common occurrence because the bears were considered to be a nuisance, and this was a way to kill off the bears, but also because they were so readily available. They would be chained and then led into an arena, which sometimes would have hundreds of people, usually on a Sunday, which is market day, would gather together and make a festival, an event of this. It was a spectator sport, a bloody spectator sport. And one of these events took place in Nevada City, and in a letter written on July 5th, 1851, there was a 22-year-old named Joseph Smith Hill, who was from Iowa, who recalled a contest, a bear and bull fight in Nevada City. He wrote this: "They brought out a bull and a grizzly bear and chained them together, the chain being long enough for them to be 12 feet apart. They got the grizzly very mad before they let him out of his cage, so they would take after the bull, which he did as soon as he was turned out. But being a very small one, a small grizzly bear, he did not hurt the bull much, and soon he got tired out, and the bull would horn him and throw him against the pen, and make the old bear bawl worse than a calf. They have another fight tomorrow." And they wiped him out. There hasn't been a grizzly bear in California since the 1890s. One of the things I found in my research that was really interesting is while there was prejudice against certain groups, against Native people and against Chinese and the Jewish population, what frequently happened because of the nature of the California Gold Rush, all of these groups were thrown together. And in order to survive in an often difficult, hostile atmosphere, they had to work together. And so, while there might be this standard that was out there, a prejudice against different groups, when you bore down into the literature, frequently you find groups that in a different setting would have nothing to do with each other, working together. And a group like the Chinese or the Jewish population that was viewed in a negative sense become partners or friends or neighbors, and they worked together, and they had great respect for each other because of the circumstances that they were in, despite the fact that society as a whole viewed them as being very separate and in prejudicial forms. One of the saddest and darkest chapters of California Gold Rush history is the treatment of the native Californians. And if you look at the first year of the California Gold Rush, which is 1848, the records indicate, the stories indicate, that 50% of all of the gold miners were natives. And as the onslaught, the tsunami, the human tsunami of the California Gold Rush came in, by the year of the 49ers, the 1849 period, so many people were coming in that the native population, which were viewed as mining partners, started to be viewed as subhuman obstacles. It started what is essentially genocide toward the Native American people. The first governor of California was Peter Burnett. And Peter Burnett had come on the Oregon Trail. He lived in Oregon, came down to California, and was elected the first governor of California after only being here a few months. And in his first State of the State address, he said that a significant problem in California was the native population. And he said it's inevitable, in his statement, inevitable that there will be a war of extermination toward the native population. And sadly, in county level, local level, and state level, that was the policy, was extermination of the native population. And if you look at the historical literature that came from that attitude that Governor Burnett expressed, there are many, many stories of wholesale slaughter of the native population. There are stories of natives being captured, rounded up, put into pens, and then being released so that they could be hunted down as if they were hunting down rabbits. And there's stories of that. There were about 300,000 native people in California at the time of the gold rush, which was the most densely populated native population anywhere in North America. And it was about 100,000 in the Sierra and the foothills, the gold country. And within about a decade, it went down to, according to one estimate, about 20,000. So about 80,000 were killed, not just physically removed, but physically eliminated. And the violence that was associated with it is a very dark chapter. And of all of the states of the United States that had a native population, I think by far the worst treatment of the native population is in California. And it continued all the way up through the 20th century, in which California was the only state for a while that did not recognize native populations as tribal groups in terms of law and protections and benefits. And that lasted all the way through the 1970s. One of the most interesting things that I found in my research was the impact of the Jewish population here in California during the gold rush. If you look at the literature of the time period, you have the standard, stereotypical, negative descriptions of the Jewish population. One historian, one Jewish population, referred to this as casual racism. And it was part of the standard reaction to the Jewish population throughout the country. But when the California gold rush hit, there were many Jewish people who came to California. Some tried it as miners, some were mine owners, but many came to California in order to become merchants, because that's where the profit was. During the California gold rush, it wasn't mining, it was mining the miners and providing supplies. And here in Grass Valley, in this part of the world, there were significant numbers of Jewish merchants who played an important role in the establishment of the city. Some of the first civic leaders were Jewish. At one point, right on Mill Street, there were almost 20 different haberdasheries, clothing stores, virtually all of them were owned and run by the Jewish population. The first charity that was established in Grass Valley was established by Jewish merchants. And as a result, in Grass Valley and Nevada City, the Jewish merchants came to be quite respected. And one family in particular, the Baru family, came to be important civic leaders and charitable leaders for decades. And while there was still this anti-Jewish sentiment that pervaded the culture, that when it got down to a day-to-day response, the Jewish merchants were very widely respected. And there was a Jewish lawyer who wrote about California during this time period and the impact of the Jewish population. Almost 10% of San Francisco's population was Jewish at one point during the gold rush. And he wrote about the impact of the Jewish population. And he said, nowhere in America, perhaps the world, he wrote, are the Jewish population more respected than here in California. And it comes down to interpersonal relationships, to these personal stories, at the same moment that there's still this negative view of Jews in general. It's a very curious phenomenon, and one that I found rather positive in looking back at the California Gold Rush, that there was this response of respect toward the Jewish population that really wasn't found anywhere else in the United States. The Chinese were not slaughtered. The Indian population were targeted, and they saw a wholesale reduction in their population. The Chinese were just removed, and there was legislation to limit their activities. For instance, there was something called the Cubic Air Ordinance that was passed in the Gold Rush communities, which limited the number of people who could live in a building because too many people used too much air. And so that was used and targeted at the Chinese. And there was also restrictions on where the Chinese could build buildings. Chinese were restricted to building on floodplains or outside of city limits. There were restrictions on occupations that the Chinese had. It essentially became laundries and restaurants. So there were restrictions that limited the freedom and movement of Chinese, but the Indian population was targeted for slaughter, and there was actually a bounty that the local communities and the state legislature ultimately passed, which gave a financial bounty for bringing in dead Indians. So there was a significant difference in how these two groups were treated. The population of Chinese was significant. In Mariposa County, it was nearly 50% of the population during the gold rush. Placer County, Nevada County, 25 to 30%. And they were everywhere and very successful miners. And there started to be a backlash. And the Chinese miners were viewed as an obstacle, that their culture was viewed as too foreign. And so there started to be an anti-Chinese sentiment that started to develop quite early in the gold rush. And it ultimately led the third governor of California, John Bigler, to issue a statement that all of the Chinese who came were coolies, which was a term that was used essentially for riffraff and almost Chinese slaves. And as a result of that, started to be viewed in a very negative sense. And so Governor Bigler issued this statement saying that it would be essentially in the best interests of California to move or remove the Chinese population. And that led a number of businessmen, Chinese leaders in San Francisco in particular, where it was becoming a much more significant Chinese population, to issue a statement counteracting what the governor said. It was a letter that was addressed to His Excellency Governor Bigler. And this Chinese leader, whose name was Noman Singh, appealed to the governor's sense of history and fairness, but he also took Bigler to task for referring to the Chinese as coolies, as kind of low-level human beings. And he wrote this. He said, The effect of your late message has thus far to prejudice the public mind against my people, to enable those who wait the opportunity to hunt them down and rob them of the rewards of their toil. You may not have meant that this should be the case, but you can see what will be the result of your propositions. And he continues on, Singh continues on, to talk about the fact that the Chinese in California are industrious, they're not crazy, they're not drunkards on this public street, they take care of themselves, they're industrious and peaceable, as he writes, and he concludes his statement with this: "We are not the degraded race you would make us. We came amongst you as mechanics or traders, and following every honorable business of life. It does not cost your state much for our criminal prosecution. We apply less to your courts for redress. And so far as I know, there are none who are a charge upon the state as paupers." And this ultimately led to others in the Chinese community to petition the government and to petition Governor Bigler to change this official policy, this negative policy toward the Chinese. And it ultimately led to, in 1862, a state investigation into the Chinese, in which they concluded in their report, it said, "It is a well-known fact that there has been a wholesale system of wrong and outrage practiced upon the Chinese population of this state, which would disgrace the most barbarous nation upon earth." But that did not stop the government in the 1870s from ultimately pursuing a policy that came to be known as Chinese exclusion. And the Chinese Exclusion Act, one of its greatest proponents, was a resident of Grass Valley who became the United States Senator from Grass Valley, Aaron Sargent. And he proposed, or was a proponent of the Chinese Exclusion Act, and was one of the major figures in pushing through this legislation that ultimately would eliminate the Chinese population from the gold fields. And in parts of the gold fields, like Mariposa County, for instance, where it was 40% Chinese, it went to nothing within a matter of years. And the Chinese were purged and removed, and ultimately those who remained here settled in Chinatown in San Francisco. I think one of the characteristics of the California Gold Rush is there's this overlay of societal values that was quite negative. But when you get into the interpersonal relationships and the personal stories, these people got along quite well. It's an interesting mix during this time period. The undeniable king of the animals during the gold rush was the mighty grizzly bear, but the most ubiquitous critter was the diminutive acquaintance of many a 49er, the lowly flea. The era's accounts are rife with lamentations about the irritating pest. Tireless evangelist William Taylor characterized the vermin, as he put it, as the Lilliputian host of the flea tribe. And New York gold seeker Hiram Pierce stated the obvious when he said, "The fleas hold undisputed sway." So common were fleas that many gold rushers attempted to battle them using a mind-over-matter technique, which either meant pointless attempts at ignoring them completely or simply adjusting to the scratchy reality. William Taylor recalled his conversation with a fellow minister, the Reverend Mr. Trumbull, who recounted, "When I first came to this place, I feared the fleas would worry the life out of me. I could neither eat nor sleep nor stay awake with any comfort. But after a few weeks I got used to them, and now I pay no attention to them. The biting of a dozen at once does not cause me to wince nor lift my pen from the paper." Most did not possess the willpower of Trumbull, however, and persistently sought some relief from the aggravating infestation. Virtually every community at one point was touched by fire. San Francisco in 1850 and 51 had 7 major fires in 18 months. And virtually every mining camp had fires to one degree or another. And in Grass Valley, one of the most significant events in the history of Grass Valley was in 1855. And there, Grass Valley was still relatively new. There was a population that had come quickly during the gold rush, transitory, moving in and out. But by 1855, there's a population of about 3,000. And the downtown of Grass Valley, that went on Mill Street, was starting to be built up. There were brick buildings, but a lot of wooden buildings still. And in 1855, one of the most prominent citizens who was becoming known throughout the region for his writings was Alonzo Delano, who was a prominent humorist and commentator that was actually more popular at one point than Bret Hart and Mark Twain. And he lived in Grass Valley. He was the first city treasurer of Grass Valley, and he was also the Wells Fargo agent. And he had his office, according to what I can figure, right at the corner of Main and Mill. That was where the Wells Fargo office was. And in 1855, a fire broke out, and it destroyed more than 300 buildings. There were only a couple of buildings that were left standing that were brick buildings, so-called fireproof buildings. One of the buildings that survived was the Wells Fargo office. Hundreds of people, thousands really, were homeless as a result of this fire. And Alonzo Delano, who was becoming a prominent figure in his own right, gave the people of Grass Valley hope. Because when the fire ended, everyone was congregating around. It was still smoldering. There's still flames licking the sky. And Alonzo Delano came down the street, down the slanty part of Main Street toward downtown, with a cart. And in his cart, he had a sign. And he put this sign up on the still smoking ruins of the Wells Fargo building that said, "Wells Fargo office open for business." And they dug through the debris, and they found the vault. And it was essentially the bank, the safe for the community. And people had their business licenses and their money and their personal belongings in this vault. And they cleared it out, and it was still hot to the touch, and they opened it up, and virtually all of the papers that were important to people had survived. And Alonzo Delano gave people hope and said, you know, in this moment of crisis, you people are strong. Under the blue vault of heaven, as he put it, you are going to demonstrate to everyone in this region the strength you have and your resilience. And he became a great booster of Grass Valley, one of the great boosters. They rebuilt, of course. One of the things they did, which I always find semi-amusing, is the fact that they thought it would be safer from fire if they paved the streets. But they paved them with wooden planks. And so there were other fires that came, and the streets caught on fire because they were wooden planks. But Alonzo Delano stayed in Grass Valley, still a very prominent figure. And after 20 years or so in the 1870s, he passed away. And he was so widely respected in Grass Valley as this booster of Grass Valley and gave them hope in their darkest moment that the mine shut down in recognition and honor of Alonzo Delano. And he's buried in Greenwood Cemetery, just off of Main Street. Thousands of people attended his funeral. All the businesses in Grass Valley stopped in order to honor Alonzo Delano. In its darkest, fire-ravaged moment, he gave the people hope. That was special, and I think he deserves some kind of recognition. As prospers. Gosh. You find us peaceable and orderly. It does not cost your state much for our You find us peaceable and orderly. Gosh. Mental block now. 3, 2, 1.